Hello everybody, welcome back to the shop. Just going to do a little video here on how to paint a door. First thing you want to do is take your brush and give it a good soaking in water. Okay, it's soaked pretty well. Now I want to take a minute to dry out the bristles. So what that does is the bristles are just damp, but we have water up here in the bristles toward the ferrule. When you paint, the paint will have a tendency to wick up the fibers of the bristles toward the ferrule. And once the paint gets up here and dries, you've pretty much ruined the paintbrush. So you want to soak your brush in the solvent of the paint you're using. Since I'm using latex paint, that's water. And again, you want the bristles dry. If the bristles are too wet, the first few dippings of paint will be a little watery, but that's not a huge deal. It's important to have damp rags or sponges handy. I already have a first coat of paint on this door. This is a hollow core, what's called a molded door. This skin that you're looking at is a wood composite material molded with a fake wood grain. You open up the paint can. I like to use 2 can openers to open a can so you don't run the risk of damaging the lid. And since this is the second coat, it's going to be a little tricky to keep track of where I painted and where I haven't. As paint dries, it tends to take on a slightly different color and sheen, which can lead you to believe there's a spot you haven't painted that you actually have. When I paint a door, I like to start at the panels, and it's just easier for me to keep track of it that way. And the idea of painting is to get the appropriate amount of paint down. You want a coating that's thick enough to produce the amount of coverage you want without being too thick. So if it's too thin, you won't get the color saturation and the coverage that you're looking for. And if it's too thick, you can get drips, sags, and puddles. So what I'm doing is using the bristles to work the paint into all the little nooks and crannies and corners, and then when you're done, you lightly drag the bristles in the direction of the wood grain so that the brush marks follow the grain pattern. And that panel is done. A good painter has the patience to take care that every single brush stroke hitting that perfect balance of the right amount of paint and the right amount of pressure. And that takes a certain temperament and patience and skill set that is not commonly found. You know, I think almost anybody can paint well for an hour or so, but to be able to stay focused on what you're doing for 8 hours a day, that's not a skill to be taken lightly. And my hat goes off to the professional painters out there, because I know it's not something I like to do. So when dragging the brush, if it's too sticky or too hard to drag, you probably need a little bit more paint. And if the brush doesn't have enough friction, you've probably got too much paint. And similarly, when you roll, it isn't so much a feel but a look. And the same with spraying. There's a kind of look that looks about right. And that comes with practice of your substrate and whichever paint you happen to be using. It's important not to go much more than a quarter of the way or so on the bristles, because you don't want the paint to wick up toward the ferrule. And when I paint with a brush, I find an awful lot of time is spent loading the brush. So I like to load it with as much paint as I can get on it. And I quickly unload the brush, and then you start applying the paint. And to unload the brush, you can lay the bristles down. And if you need a little more paint, I've got some paint that I dabbed down when I first unloaded the brush. Since there's a ridge here, it's important to drag the bristles this way to the edge. Drag it too hard this way like that, you're going to get a little bit of a paint scraping effect. And I'm working the bristles back and forth to get the paint into all the nooks and crannies of the fake wood grain. In my experience, it takes about a half hour, 40 minutes or so to paint the face of a door with a brush if you want to do a quality job and take the time to do it right. So if you're paying somebody, you should be prepared to pay for that kind of time commitment. Obviously not all doors are the same. You know, flat doors or doors without grain might go a little quicker. And there are other techniques you can use to speed it up. If I have more than one door to paint, I will often use a brush and roller. I find that goes a little bit quicker, but there is a greater amount of setup and cleanup time that kind of makes it a wash if you're only painting one door. And it's a little close if you're painting 2 doors. But if you're painting more than 2 door faces, then that's a quicker way to go. On the first coat, I had to be a lot more meticulous to work the paint into the primer, but the second coat, since it's already got some amount of filling from the first coat of paint, is going much quicker. Every few minutes you have to go back to areas you've just done and inspect your work for signs that you didn't quite get it right. Where this door is horizontal, I have a valley that runs around in all the panels, and I look at that to see if there isn't an excess amount of paint that's pooled in the valleys. And this one's looking pretty good. Okay, I have each of the 6 panels painted, and I'm ready to move on to the stiles and rails. When painting a door, it looks better if the brush marks go in directions of the grain. So it's important to understand how the grain should be running. On the left and right side of the door, you have these stiles that run all the way from the top to the bottom. So you will drag the brush marks all the way along the left and right edges. There's a rail that runs from here to here over these 2 panels, and a similar rail between these 4 panels, and there's a short stile here, so the brush marks will run from here to here, and similar stiles between the other panels. It's also important to try to paint all 6 sides of the door to help the door deal with seasonal changes in humidity a little bit better. One advantage of brushing is it gives you the opportunity to use the bristles of the brush to sort of massage the paint into the nooks and crannies and grain and pores or whatever of the substrate that you're painting. And you can't really get that effect with other techniques like rolling or spraying. To the point you can, you try to look at your work against different angles of the light, making notes of color and sheen and striations and whatnot. The goal is to get a nice even coat that'll dry with minimal brush marks and look good. Personally, I don't make any apologies for painted surfaces that look like they're painted, so I don't try to hide brush marks as much as you want the surface to look like somebody who knew what they were doing finished the surface. And I suppose that stems from the fact I like to consider myself a craftsman, at least to some degree, and I have an appreciation for things that look like they were made or built by people with knowledge, skills, and abilities. And I also appreciate painted surface, as people have been painting things as long as there's been paint around. And it's certainly practical, and it creates a different look that I don't think is bad. So personally, I kind of chuckle when you run across people talk about a quote-unquote factory finish, especially when you're talking about things like this, wood and wood trim and things that could very well be handmade, because their idea of a factory finish looks like something made by robots or some synthetic plasticky surface that personally I don't think belongs so much in a home as much as a sanitary environment, maybe in a hospital or something, and that's not a look I particularly care for. So here's a prime side of a similar door, and although it looks like it's an off-white, once I paint it with the bright white of the trim color, you'll see it's not very close to white at all. And this is to illustrate how it's a little more important to make sure you get a nice thick coat on, and that the tips of the bristles get into all these corners. And you not only get every nook and cranny, but the paint's got to be reasonably thick. And with something like a door, you can actually do what I call sort of a coat and a half. You can put a coat on, and if it's had 15 minutes or so to skin over or tack up, you can put a little more paint on without mucking up the original finish. So that looks good, but once it starts to dry, you're going to see the primer underneath start to come through, and then I have to go back over it, get a little more paint on it for a little bit more saturation. And again, I don't know if this is showing up, but this area here, the paint's thicker than it is out here. And if I go back and just lay a little more paint on it, you can see it looks definitely whiter. Now I'm going to show you how to paint a door with the famed brush and roller technique. I'm going to use the roller to apply the paint and then drag it with the brush to get the brush marks looking good. And the reason why you want to use a roller is that even though it takes a little longer to load the paint onto a roller, it holds 5-10 times as much paint as a brush does. So once you get this guy loaded up, you can paint a significantly larger portion of the door, and then can spend a lot less time trying to get the paint everywhere with the brush. I have this nifty little plastic contraption that I got at a local hardware store. As soon as I saw it, I knew it was something that I wanted. You can use this to load up your brush without making a total mess of the world. It's going to take a minute or so to get it loaded the first time. Okay, I have the roller loaded, and you can use the edges to get down into valleys. I also dampened the roller like I dampen the brushes. You have to be a little more careful with the roller because it holds so much more liquid that a roller that appears to be damp can have way too much water on it. You take the brush and you still have to kind of massage, paint around, get into the areas you want, just like that. We have pretty much the perfect amount of paint. It's all dragged out, brush marks going in the correct direction, and voila. And let's move on. The roller leaves roller marks, which I personally think looks pretty hideous on a piece of wood trim or a door. Looks fine on a wall, but not on something that's supposed to be wood. You have the stippled rolled surface and you drag it. The brush gets the paint worked into all the little crevices and cracks and imperfections. And the disadvantage of this technique, if you want to clean the roller, that's going to take time. On top of cleaning the brush, if you just throw it away, but you still have to clean the tray. And having a roller and a brush invites a slightly higher chance you might make a mess that has to be cleaned up halfway through. Okay, I have the 6 panels done, doing the flat areas. Goes really quick. The roller does a really good job putting a nice coat on without a lot of fussing. As I'm doing this, I see a few pinholes where the roller didn't deposit the paint. And you just have to hit it with the brush, an extra stroke or two to the brush can work the paint in. And another thing to note is it is possible with the roller kind of get out in front of the tips of your skis, so to speak. You can roll quite an area, and if you take too much time dinking around with your brush in one area, by the time you get to another area it might have started to tack up on you, making it harder to work with the brush. Dragging the bristles just to take out any ridges that may be there from the brush. And I've gone over it a couple times looking for puddles or drips or similar, and any holiday areas where the paint looks a little too thin. Okay, so I'm finishing up the door, at least this face of it. And it went a little quicker than brushing, but I still have to clean up. So in cleaning a brush, you want to get the paint out of the bristles. So you want the water to be washing down the bristles of the brush. You don't want the water to be going in. It'll push the paint up toward the ferrule. And the first phase is just let it rinse through. It's going to take a lot of water, but that's okay. And I find shunting the bristles on the bottom spreads it a little bit, loosens them, lets the water get in a little easier. And then I use my hand to do similar. You can also use a stiff bristle brush, and you could even use a wire brush. And finally, when you think you're done, it's best to swish the brush in some clean water. And you can see that's just a little cloudy. So we did pretty well so far. And we'll do that a couple more times until the water stays pretty gosh darn clear. And that's pretty good. With most paintbrushes you can twirl them between your palms, dry them out, give them a good shake, and reform bristles nice and straight. And if you let that dry like that, it'll be ready to use for the next one. So there you have it. How to paint a door with a brush, and how to do it with a brush and a roller. And hope you got something out of this. As always, appreciate you coming by. Stay safe, take care, and check me out on the next one.